Society session today. It's my privilege. My name is Paul Kirk, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker. It is always trite to say that the speaker needs no introduction, but that really is the case in introducing Don Trunkey, who has been such a formidable presence here at OHSU for the last 15 years or so during his tenure of Chair of Surgery. As we all know, Don has an international reputation as a leading trauma surgeon and as a leading organizer of trauma systems worldwide. And many of you will have had the opportunity to have read the delightful profile that was published in the Oregonian just a few weeks ago. I've had the pleasure of working with Don for the last many years, and he has constantly reminded me of his Scots heritage. As you may know, the Scots have a very formal side to them, and it is my particular pleasure today to welcome the unkilted Donald Trunkey.
Thank you. Well, if I had only known, I'd have worn my kilt, Paul. Thank you. Every one of you in this audience have heroes. And I'm going to tell you a story this afternoon about one of my heroes. Next slide. Do I have the changer up here? Oh, here it is. Lawrence Chamberlain was born on the 8th of September, 1828, son of Joshua and Sarah Chamberlain. He was named for Commodore Lawrence of the American Navy, which was fairly prophetic because it was Lawrence who gave us the aphorism, "Don't give up the ship." This is the family home in Brewer, Maine, which is very close to Bangor. In his childhood, he was remarkable, probably no more than any other person growing up in Maine at that time. Clearing fields, plowing, mowing hay, chopping wood, hoeing, weeding. At age 14, he attended military school where he studied languages. He was considered by his peers as an excellent horseman, swimmer, and he loved sailing. He learned the Mohawk language. He joined the First Congregational Church at age 16, and then in 1846 he decided to attend Bowdoin College. There was a period of time before he could matriculate, and so he taught at North Milford School for 6 months and entered Bowdoin in February of 1848. A little bit about the person himself. It was traditional at that time that each class would go out several miles from Bowdoin and dig up a tree and bring it back and plant it. Well, on the time that his class did this, they were bringing the tree back, and they stopped at a little village at a pub. They got very rowdy and drunk, and the next day the dean decided that he was going to punish those that had been the most rowdy. He called Chamberlain into his office and wanted him to name the people who had been most rowdy. Chamberlain refused, so the dean expelled him from school. His classmates got together, went to the dean, and said, no, it was us. Chamberlain had nothing to do with it. Chamberlain was, in fact, at that time, a teetotaler. But it was kind of reflective of his personality and his loyalty to his friends. He had a stammer that he had to overcome during his time at Bowdoin. And then his third year was marked that he had to drop out completely because he was probably suffering from tuberculosis, which a number of his family members had. And his brother eventually died from this. He also became very much a student of Professor Stowe's wife, Harriet Beecher Stowe, an abolitionist, and he spent many Saturday evenings in her home listening to her tell some of the stories that she had put together. He graduated in 1852 He was named the first-class oration. This was a very pedantic, very long lecture that did not go over well. He then decided, primarily by his mother's wishes, to attend Bangor Theologic Seminary, and he did so. And he then went on eventually to become an instructor in natural theology and logic at Bowdoin in 1855. One of his biographers has characterized him in the following way. He was slim, muscular, standing 5 foot 10 and a half inches. He had an erect way of carrying himself, however, which gave the impression of more stature. His presence was so remarkable and gave such an effect. His light gray-blue eyes were arresting, especially when he looked up, and they often commanded attention with their flashing vitality. The handsome classic nose, shaped like a hawk's beak, gave him a fine profile, and the long, full mustache below it, romantic and faintly swashbuckling, swept to his jaw on each side. He met Frances Caroline Adams, Fanny, who was born in August 12th of 1825. Her parents were unable to care for her, and so she was adopted by an elder brother of Asher Adams, and it was kind of awkward because he had married a woman that eventually was about the same age as Fanny. She has been described as dark-haired and spirited and self-centered. She met Joshua at the First Parish Church, and they carried on a romance for several years, but became engaged in 1852 when he graduated from Bowdoin. They then became separated for 3 years because she went to Georgia to teach, and they did not see each other during that time. She wrote him a letter during her final year in Georgia and said that she did not want to marry a preacher. We don't know whether this influenced him, but he decided at that time to get a job at Bowdoin. They were married on the 7th of December, 1855. A daughter was born the following October, and they had 5 children, of which only 3 survived. At Bowdoin, he became professor in modern language of Europe, tenured in a very short period of time, in 6 years, which was remarkable in those days. And then, in 1862, a number of his students had joined the Union Army, and he told the dean that he was going to France on a sabbatical to study French language, and then went down and promptly enlisted in the Union Army. He was appointed by the governor of Maine at that time as a lieutenant colonel in the 20th Maine, and his commanding officer was Albert Ames, who was a West Point graduate. And it was basically from Ames that he learned a lot of what he was going to use later on, although he had attended the military school at age 14. He missed Antietam, not because he wasn't there, it was because the 20th Maine was held in reserve. And probably, fortunately for me, it was, because if Burnside had put them in, which he should have done, they might have defeated the Confederates that day. They outnumbered the Confederates 3-2, but Burnside made about as many mistakes as you could at Antietam. And fortunately for us, he was not entered into the conflict and did not die or did not become one of the 23,000 killed that day. His first 2 wounds were sustained at Fredericksburg on December 13th, 1862, when he got a flesh wound through the ear and then through the neck. Probably the same mini ball, but we cannot prove that. He actually went forward across the river up into the area where the Confederates were. They commanded the high ground, and they were behind this stone wall, and so they had the advantage clearly. The first time they went up, they spent 1 night there, and during that period of time, Chamberlain had to get the bodies of 2 other soldiers to pull over him so that he would not be killed during the firefight that ensued at about 10 to 11 o'clock that night. They were withdrawn and then reinserted back into the battle the following day, and they spent another night. Then the 20th Maine was selected to be in charge of the retreat, the last unit to basically be withdrawn. And as they were being withdrawn, General Hooker came up and he said, "You've had a hard chance, Colonel. I'm glad to see you out of it." It was chance, General, not much intelligent design there. Hooker, God knows I did not put you in. That was the trouble, General. You should have put us in. We were handed in piecemeal on tasting forks. Chamberlain always did speak his mind, and this is one such example. I think, though, that Hooker actually appreciated that. These are the ruins of Fredericksburg after the battle. This was actually the first major battle where photographers were allowed in at the time or shortly thereafter. This is the Confederate redoubt up above on the hills looking out over the stone wall. In the spring of 1863, Chamberlain was held in quarantine because 2 of his soldiers had been exposed to smallpox. So they missed Chancellorsville. At the same time, and this was made famous in the movie Gettysburg, the 2nd Maine was being disbanded. However, 120 of the soldiers had accidentally signed up for an indefinite period instead of the traditional 2 years. And so they were kept on, and of course they were threatening to mutiny. Chamberlain handled this very well, and they actually became part of the 20th Maine. They broke camp as well as the rest of the Union Army in May of 1863. Chamberlain sustained a sunstroke because of unseasonal heat in mid-June, and then 2 days prior to Gettysburg, Hooker, who had replaced Burnside, was replaced by Meade. So Meade went into Gettysburg almost completely unprepared. Chamberlain's 3rd and 4th wounds occurred in Gettysburg on July 2nd. One of these wounds was a shell fragment or possibly a rock to his right instep. The more serious potential wound was a bullet that hit his scabbard, denting it, and that scabbard is still available, and this hammered against his left thigh, causing a severe bruise. If it not hit his scabbard, he most surely would have had to have a mid-thigh amputation, which at that time had a mortality of about 60%. This was the situation. Interestingly, Lee had taken the Virginian Army up into southern Pennsylvania and was actually approaching Gettysburg from the north, whereas Meade had come up from the south, and so the Confederates were coming into the north side of Gettysburg and the Union Army from the south. The 5th Corps crossed into Pennsylvania on the 1st of July, 1863. They reached the outskirts at about 700 in the morning. General Sickles, this is Dan Sickles, not Horatio Sickles, moved the 3rd Corps forward about a half a mile below Little Round Top, and they went in through the peach orchard into the wheat field to Devil's Den. They were out in front approximately 1/2 mile and were about to be encircled by the Confederates when Meade recognized what was going on, pulled him back, but he almost completely obliterated his 3rd Corps, and there were a number of mortalities. At the same time, Meade recognized that Round Top was unprotected. Round Top was the Union Army's left flank, and I'll show you a map of that in just a second. This is looking down from Little Round Top into the Devil's Den, and the wheat field was just beyond this. This is all overgrown with pines. This is the situation on the first day, on July 2nd in the morning, when Sickles went out into the wheat field and again towards the Confederate lines. This left this entire area exposed, and if the Confederates could come around, they would have come up behind and wiped out the entire Union Army. This is the battle in the wheat field. There were a lot of casualties, an inordinate amount on the Union side. This is looking just the opposite way from the Confederate positions. This is Little Round Top, and this is Big Round Top. Not mountains by any standard here in Oregon, but they were considered mountains then. This is looking up to the monuments that now exist on Little Round Top, primarily the Michigan, the New York, and then the 20th Maine is around to this side. So this is the situation after Sickles had gone into the wheat field. The 20th Maine was located on the brow of the hill of Little Round Top, looking into the right flank of the Confederates. He was outnumbered 2-1. He sent men down here to stop the flanking movement by the 15th Alabama, which was commanded by this man, Warren Oates. This is the furthest the Confederates got up the hill, is at this monument marking the 20th Maine. The battle started at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they carried 60 rounds each, and within about 45 minutes, his men were out of ammunition. They had used up as much ammunition they could get off of the wounded and the dead, and so Chamberlain, and not probably in desperation, but just reflecting his courage, had them mount their bayonets, and then he gave the single command, bayonet. And they charged down the hill at the 15th and the 4th Alabama. And this is an artist's rendition as they come down this hill. Chamberlain led the charge just with a pistol and his sword. As he reached the base of the hill, this captain in the Confederate Army held up his pistol right almost point-blank range at Chamberlain's head, pulled the trigger, and it misfired. Chamberlain then captured the captain with his sword. This is the photographer's pictures afterwards showing the carnage that occurred on the hill. Most of these were Confederate dead. There were approximately 100 to 150 killed and wounded of the Confederates. The 20th Maine lost 30 killed in action, 105 wounded, and in turn they took 308 Confederate prisoners. James Rice, who was commanding the 44th New York, which was just 2 battalions over to Chamberlain's right, said, "Colonel Chamberlain, your gallantry was magnificent and your coolness and skill saved us." And I don't think there's any question that that was true. The following year, the situation was as such. Grant had been named General of the Potomac, and they fought a significant battle at Chancellorsville, but not decisive. Then again at Spotsylvania, and then they considered continued south towards Richmond, a battle at North Anna, then a major battle at Cold Harbor, and finally the siege of Petersburg, which occurred between June of 1864 and April of 1865. Chamberlain's 5th wound occurred on June 18, 1864. This was a through-and-through wound of the pelvis. He is the only person recorded during the Civil War to have survived such a wound. The counts do vary, and I'll try to make it as clear as I can. This is the situation. The Army of the Potomac was right here, looking northwest into Petersburg, and the Confederates were here. And they had built these embankments and very, very extensively guarded. Now, Chamberlain had premonitions for approximately a year that he was going to either die or have a significant injury. 1 week before his injury, he wrote to his wife, "Most likely I shall be hit somewhere at some time, but at all times my times are in his hands." At 10:30, a rebel battery came out from Petersburg and advanced toward the Union Army. Chamberlain led a brigade to halt the rebels, and he was so successful that he became isolated 1 mile in front of the Union front. Grant heard of this and ordered a full Army of the Potomac attack, take advantage of what Chamberlain had achieved. And at 1500, Chamberlain was supposed to lead the attack towards Reeves' salient. He really questioned that order, and he sent a notice back to Grant. Fully aware of the responsibility I take, I beg to be assured that the order to attack with my single brigade is with the general's full understanding. From what I can see of the enemy's line, it is my opinion that if an assault is to be made, it should be nothing less than the whole army. Grant reaffirmed the order, and Chamberlain then addressed his troops. "We know that some must fall. It may be any of you or I, but I feel that you will all go in manfully and make such a record as will make all of our loyal American people forever grateful." He had great trepidation in carrying out this order. This is looking towards Reeves' salient. This was taken after the war, but you can see the terrible destruction that had occurred here. And Chamberlain was supposed to start at this point, go down into this little valley, go up here, and this is the area that he was supposed to attack. From the top of the rise in the breastwork, a Confederate soldier fired too low. His bullet hit a rock somewhere under the swampy grounds of the gully, ricocheted upward, and struck Chamberlain in the low side of the right hip, just in front of the hip bone. It missed the bone, but passed through his lower abdomen. This is inaccurate. Traveling diagonally backward, nicking the bladder and urethra, and doing more damage inside than the entrance wound would indicate. The ball came to rest just under the skin at Chamberlain's other hip behind the bone. This is Chamberlain's own words. In the hiss and roar and blinding, flying or standing and so signaling, I felt a sharp, hot flash that seemed to cut my backbone. My thought was that I had been shot in the back, in the middle of the back, below the belt. This was all I could think of for a moment, and the shame of it was worse than death, to be shot in the back in the face of the enemy. He was a little bit of a romantic. A minute has not passed when I felt in my sword hand a gush of hot blood. I looked down. Then for the first time I saw the blood spurting out of my right hip side and saw that it had already filled my long cavalry boots to overflowing, and also my baggy reinforced trousers, and was running out at both pocket wells. Not shot in the back then. I do not think I was ever so happy in my life. My first thought was of my mother, how glad she would be that her boy was not shot in the back. I lay straight out on my back, too weak to move a limb, the blood forming a pool under and around me, more blood than the books allow a man. I had not much pain. It was stunning blow, a kind of dull tension. My teeth shut sharp together, hard like lockjaw. So I lay, looking, thinking, sinking, the tornado tearing over and around. Lieutenant Wes Funk and Benjamin Walters drug him to relative safety. An hour later, they carried him by stretcher through a bombardment, and he was taken to a division hospital 3 miles back from the lines. At 1700, 3 hours after his wound, Drs. R.A. Everett and DeWitt probed the wound with the ramrod of a rifle. Remember, there's no x-ray in these days. It was very common to probe the wound, but they had these little small probes, but his was so deep they used the ramrod off of the rifle, and this was without anesthetic. They found the missile under the skin behind the left hip. Chamberlain said to his surgeons, "Lay me on one side, I am all right. Go and take care of my dear boys." A connoidal bullet penetrated both hips and was extracted. This is what DeWitt, the surgeon, said. And this is the bullet that exists in the Pejepscot Museum in Maine. Chamberlain's brother heard that he had been injured and brought Dr. Shaw and Townsend of the 20th Maine to him. Everett stated Chamberlain had no chance of surviving. The wound was again probed. Chamberlain's made them continue, did not have an anesthetic. He said, "I never dreamed what pain could be and not kill a man outright." He was then carried 16 miles the following day by stretcher to City Point on the Potomac River. He was loaded on the steamer Connecticut by Dr. Townsend and taken to a general hospital in Annapolis, where he was under the care of Dr. Vanderkeef. This is the general hospital at City Point. We do not know whether Chamberlain stopped there, but he was loaded on this particular boat, the Connecticut. Vanderkeef recorded, reached the hospital at that place very comfortably on June 20th, 1864, with a shot wound involving both buttocks and the urethra. That is inaccurate. What I've done here is with a patient the same size, same height, same weight, is I've done a 3D reconstruction of the pelvis, showing that the missile probably passed through the pubic rami here. If it had gone any higher, it would have got the iliac artery, and that clearly would have been fatal. If it had gotten any lower, it would have probably gone through the rectum, which would have been equally fatal. So it was a well-placed bullet for Chamberlain, going through the bladder and exiting out the iliac wing of the left pelvis. Remember, it was found underneath the skin behind the greater trochanter here, and the entrance wound was approximately right here, and if you draw a line between that, you get the probable trajectory. Now, I can't guarantee that, because when a missile hits bone, it may be deflected. Nevertheless, I think this is about as an accurate depiction as I could come up with. This is what General Hodgson wrote to Major Charles Gilmore. His wound is a very severe one and a very dangerous one. The surgeons are by no means certain of saving his life. The ball passed through the lower part of the abdomen and severed the urethra. This is inaccurate. So near the bladder that by no artificial means can all the urine be conducted from the bladder without some of it escaping and passing out through the wounds at the opening, which is the right side of the right leg, 2 inches below the hip joint. It is feared that ulcers will form in the abdomen and terminate his life. This, however, is what the physician who examined him for his official pension from the Army in 1873 recorded, and I think this is about the most accurate description we can find. The ball entered the right hip in front of and a little below, not 2 inches, but a little below the right trochanter major, passed diagonally backward and made exit above and posteriorly to the left greater trochanter. The bladder was involved. And he points out that his fistula was caused by a catheter. This is General Grant's field promotion of Chamberlain on the day that he was injured. It's the only incident during the Civil War that a person was given a field commission to Brigadier General. In his memoirs, this is the actual special orders doing so, but then in his memoirs, Grant said, Colonel Chamberlain of the 20th Maine was wounded on the 18th. He was gallantly leading his brigade at the time, as he had been in the habit of doing all engagements in which he had previously been engaged. He had several times been recommended for a brigadier generalcy for gallant and meritorious conduct. On this occasion, I promoted him on the spot, and at last a gallant and meritorious officer received partial justice at the hands of his government, which he served so faithfully and so well. He wrote a letter the day after he was wounded to his wife. I am lying mortally wounded, the doctors think, but my mind and heart are at peace. Jesus Christ is my all-sufficient Savior. I go to him. God bless and keep and comfort you, precious one. You have been a precious wife to me. To know and love you makes life and death beautiful. Cherish the darlings and give my love to all the dear ones. Do not grieve too much for me. We shall all soon meet. His prose was very romantic. This is the only medical records that I could find in the National Archives reflecting on his care at Annapolis. Most of them had been burned when the hospital was destroyed later. Nevertheless, it marks his movement to Annapolis and his care by Dr. Vanderkeep. This is also from the 6-volume set of the War of the Rebellion, the Medical and Surgical History, and in here Vanderkeep says, I send you a catheter used by Brigadier General JLC, United States Volunteers. As you will perceive, it is covered by calculus deposit. This is a glass catheter that was traditionally used in those days. He said, I think it is a very important specimen illustrating the necessity of often removing catheters or renewing catheters when they are to be used à demure. The history you shall get when the patient is discharged. Unfortunately, he never sent that. But this is a close-up of the catheter showing the calculus deposits, and it's this curvature that probably caused the fistula to develop in his perineum. And this is just a repeat of that without quotes. Later, Chamberlain was to recount, I am not of Virginia blood, she is of mine. At Annapolis, he made a slow but steady recovery. Fanny came to him, nursed him, tended him, and then he was furloughed home on the 20th of September, 1864. Much to Fanny's dismay, he decided to return to duty. He did not have to, but he did. He considered it his duty to do so, and he did this on the 18th of November, 1864. He wrote a letter to his brother, I ride some too much, probably, and to tell the truth, I don't feel right yet, though the Herald, a newspaper in Maine, proclaims my perfect recovery and all that, I shall have to take to the knife again, and am making up my mind where to have it done. That is, the knifing. He was referring to his urethral fistula. For me, I am managing to do full duty without much injury and not a great deal of suffering. Still, I was not fit to return to field duty, and it is very hard to take such chances as we had on the Weldon raid. He led a raid, if you will, to the south of Petersburg to try to cut off one of the railroads that was bringing in supplies. He was made commander of the 1st Brigade, 5th Corps, and then he made the Weldon raid in December. On the 15th of January, he left the military to go to Philadelphia for his surgery by, in his own words, the most skillful surgeon in the United States. However, we don't know whether it was Joseph Pancoast or William Pancoast. Both were surgeons. One, very famous one, Pancoast syndrome is named after. William Pancoast, however, was a military surgeon that is most likely to operate on him, but I could find no records in the Philadelphia Academy of Medicine on this. He returned to duty 1 month later, and his fistula recurred. This was the situation when he returned to duty. Johnson was being confronted by Sherman, and of course Grant was just outside Richmond, and Lee and Johnson were intended to meet up in the mountains, and there they would have a choice. They could surrender, they could carry on a guerrilla warfare, or they could go deeper into the South and try to regroup and get more soldiers to carry on the fight. As I said, he returned to duty on the 21st of February. Grant planned to come south of Petersburg and to cut off this railroad so that they could no longer get supplies into Petersburg or to Richmond. He also wanted to prevent Lee from escaping to the west, so the plan was to come around, flank him, and come in from behind. This is what actually happened. As they broke out from Petersburg, you can see that Lee went originally north of Grant's army. Then they crisscrossed, which was kind of interesting. And the Battle of Five Forks is what I'm going to discuss next. But you can see this was very close to the end of the war. But this probably some of the most brutal fighting in the entire war. Chamberlain's 6th and 7th wounds occurred on 29th March 1865 on Quaker Road. This involved his left arm and his chest, but the history is very muddled. The situation on the 29th was as follows. The Confederates were located north of the 1st Brigade, and Chamberlain was coming north on Quaker Road at this point, and there was a sawdust pile at about this time, or place rather. He was riding his horse, Charlemagne. He was out in front of his troops, which was usual, and he pulled up his horse to let his troops catch up with him, and as the horse came up, a bullet passed through the neck of the horse, through his left arm, and hit him in the left chest right over his heart. Just at that instant, a heavy blow struck me on the left breast just below the heart. I fell forward on my horse's neck and lost all consciousness. He fell to the ground. Major General Gouverneur Warren rode up at this time, got down, thought the Chamberlain was dead, and said, "You are gone, sir." Chamberlain's eyes came open at that time, and he said, "You are right, I am gone." And he got back on his horse and continued his charge. The bullet had riddled my sleeve to the elbow and bruised and battered my bridle arm so that it was useless. And the obstructions it met, this was a map case and a compass right over his heart, had slightly deflected it so that instead of striking the point of my heart, it had followed around 2 ribs so as to come out at the back seam of my coat. This is what I think the wound did. It entered the skin, went around between 2 ribs, and then exited it when it hit the spinous process posteriorly. Now, most surgeons or most people don't believe that such a wound could occur. but it can. This was not a contemporary, but it was close, account. Bullet wounds are quite prone to ricochet around the chest from a rebound off the rib or sternum. I have seen several cases where a 32 or larger calibered bullet at close range has struck the lateral chest wall, caromed against a rib, and passed halfway around the chest to appear subcutaneously almost at the level of the entrance. I have personally taken care of 2 such wounds. They're very dramatic. You see a gunshot wound here and one out the backside, and you do not understand why the patient's alive, but it has gone around the 2 ribs. It was when he got medical care later that afternoon, it was where the title of this talk comes from. General Horatio, not Dan, Sickles, was having his arm amputated, and he looked over at Chamberlain and he said, "General, you have the soul of the lion and the heart of the woman." He regained command of his troops the following day, and they continued north towards the Confederates at 5 Forks. The following day, Chamberlain played a pivotal role because his group was the one that turned the entire flank of the Confederates, and as they marched down across the northern side of the Confederates, they had them between a pincer movement, and they caused severe destruction to the entire Confederate force and putting them into a situation where they were fleeing. At the same time, Grant assaulted Petersburg. Sheridan attacked north toward the Sutherland Station. Chamberlain headed northwest towards the South Side Railroad to cut it off, and then east towards Sutherland Station. Lee advised the government to leave Richmond on the 2nd of April. The Confederates evacuated Richmond and Petersburg's defenses. Lee tried to escape to join Johnson. That was unsuccessful. And the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps pursued Lee towards Appomattox. He was cornered at Appomattox Courthouse. They exchanged notes on the 7th and 8th of April, and the full surrender occurred on the 9th, and the agreement was signed in the Wilmer McLean House near Appomattox Courthouse. Chamberlain was picked by Grant to command the surrender ceremonies. He requested to be able to command the 1st Division's 3rd Brigade, where the 20th Maine was, and then Major General John B. Gordon was to represent the Confederates. This was the infantry. As Gordon and his troops passed, a bugle was sounded. At Chamberlain's command, the Union soldiers snapped to attention and then to carry arms. Honor answering honor. This is an artist's rendition of Chamberlain receiving General Gordon's call. When General Gordon passed, he made his steed rise, saluting Chamberlain. The 118th Pennsylvania recorded, if any one of the 5th Army Corps maintained a spotless name and won enduring fame during the operations of the Corps from the 29th of March to the 9th of April, 1865, more than commensurate with the range of the command he held, that one was Joshua Chamberlain. 5 days later, Lincoln was assassinated. There was chaos in Washington, D.C. General Haig may have been there. I don't know, but the Army was going to take over the country. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Chamberlain set out for Richmond on the 1st of May. He went to Petersburg to pay tribute to Major General Warren, and then he marched into Richmond on the 6th of May, and he reached Arlington Heights, looking out over Washington, D.C. on the 12th of May, and then took part in a grand parade on the 24th. On the 28th, the Army of the Potomac ceased to exist. Grant then visited Chamberlain in Brunswick, learned of his medical problems, and then was responsible to have him come back into the Army so he could have his surgery. During his campaigns, Chamberlain commanded troops in 24 battles, 8 reconnaissances, and countless skirmishes. He was wounded by shot or shell 6 times, 7 if you count the last one going through his arm first, and soldiers under his command captured 2,700 prisoners and 8 battle flags. He wrote to his sister on the 6th of June, "My wounds still trouble me." Shortly thereafter, Grant saw him, and they brought him back into the military. The curator at the Chamberlain Museum records, "He suffered constant pain in both hips, and the whole lower part of his abdomen was tender and sensitive. His bladder especially was very painful and irritable, and the large urinary fistula at the base of his penis troubled him exceedingly. In addition, he suffered lameness in his left breast where he had been wounded at the Battle of Quaker Road." This is the order bringing him back into the military. He was then operated again in February of 1866 This operation also failed to close his urethral fistula. In September of the same year, he was elected governor of Maine for 4 one-year terms. In 1868, he applied for the pension that you saw the pension results. In 1867, he was made board of trustees, or made a member of the board of trustees at Bowdoin. And in 1871, he became president of Bowdoin. In 1868, Fanny threatened to divorce him while he was governor. Now, some of his biographers put a big deal of concern into this, saying that Chamberlain was impotent. I've consulted with Dr. John Barry, and John Barry assures me that he had no physiologic reason to be impotent. Whether he was psychologically impotent is another case, and we'll never solve that one. But with the urethral fistula and his pain that he was having in his wounds, it is possible that he had psychological impotence. But there is no anatomic or physiologic reason that he would have been impotent. They patched up their problems, whatever they might have been, and they lived out a very happy marriage. In 1878, he was made the U.S. Commissioner of Education of Paris at the Universal Exposition. In 1880, there was a dispute in Maine over the elections, and a civil war almost erupted, and Chamberlain became military commander and quelled the riot. He then participated in the Warren hearing. This was Major General Warren, who had been sacked by Sheridan because of the fight at Five Oaks, and Warren was eventually cleared of all charges of cowardice, primarily because of Chamberlain's testimony. He resigned as Bowdoin president in 1883, and then he underwent his final operation in 1883 by John Warren at Massachusetts General Hospital. This is a letter from Warren to Chamberlain advising him to come down for surgery for his fistula. This failed also. Then, in 1893, he was given the Medal of Honor for his heroism at Little Round Top. This was at the instigation of his troops. His wounds became infected, and he was bedfast sometimes up to months. He often would have urinary drainage out of his hip, as well as pus and sequestra of bone. In 1900, he was appointed surveyor of the Port of Portland, a sinecure. In the 18th of October in 1905, Fanny died. In her last 3 years, she had been blind, and he had taken care of her during that entire time. He really did love her. Then he volunteered in 1898 to go back into the service for the Spanish-American War. This was at age 70. He returned to Gettysburg in 1912 with Dr. Abner Shaw. 2 years later, he became bedfast from infection in his hip wounds, and on the 24th of February 1914, he died of his wounds, urinary sepsis. This was his own epitaph, the proud young valor that rose above the mortal, and then at last was mortal after all. Chamberlain was a remarkable man. He is one of my heroes. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did giving it.
We do have time for a couple of questions for Don, if anybody has them.
Yes. Well, he had every reason to have post-traumatic distress. There is a book that has a psychological profile on him. And yes, it does bring that up. As near as I can tell from all of his biographers, he conducted himself later in life just as honorably as he did during the war. I don't ever have any hard evidence that he did have post-traumatic stress. Any other questions? Well, thank you again.